Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have you join. Some of you in person, some of you will be watching the recording of this later. And we have several great topics to go through, some of which we've picked because they generate lots of questions in the ALS clinic representing hot topics that people want to know about, many of which are complex. And we're not going to rid you of the complexity, unfortunately. We hope you can understand things better as we go through these topics and incorporate some of the nuance and fusion of values, unknowns, and respect where we are at in terms of our journey and evolution of understanding as things do evolve going forward. So I'm pleased to start talking about the first topic of one of many today, and this is the oral Edaravone suspension formula. And so this is the latest Health Canada approved treatment for ALS, and we've been able to say that this year and last year, and based on FDA's recent approval of tofersen, we would anticipate being able to say that next year, as we have quite a momentum in the field of ALS with developments, and you all know that's a huge need and well needed. So I do have some disclosures just so you're aware that personally, I have consulting fees with all of the pharmaceutical industries that develop treatments currently for ALS, Biogen, Amylyx, and Mitsubishi Tanabe. There's a few things I wanted to cover to start with so that we can have a common understanding moving forward, and so some of this is basic and stuff you already know. But in terms of just how clinical trials operate, there's typically a group of individuals, and in our case specifically, patients living with ALS, who will then be randomized into two groups, one of which receives the drug and one of which receives the placebo. And the purpose of this is that each group then is supposed to be, in theory, as close and identical to each other as possible, with the only exception being the intervention. And obviously in this picture, the intervention or placebo shouldn't look like a candy compared to the drug. Everything should look identical. And that helps lead to seeing what's the most likely true response of an intervention or treatment. And as a therapeutic gets developed, there's several stages, and it starts with extensive, often preclinical scientific work going into clinical trials in humans with phase 1. And at this point, safety is the primary concern and the primary thing that people are looking for. But as you move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, safety remains a top priority. But the goal is to then start to look more and more at how much an intervention works and what its true effect is. Typically, historically, drugs will then go under review in the States, that's FDA, and in Canada, that's Health Canada, before coming to market as a therapy that people can take outside of clinical trials. There are exceptions to this, and we'll talk about some. And we look at evidence in different ways because there's different quality of evidence, and randomized trials that I just discussed represent a high quality of evidence because of the rigor that goes into designing them to make those groups as equal as possible and to control as many factors as possible. And so there may be studies out there that are less quality evidence, and sometimes they can be in conflict with a higher level of quality. And therefore, we need to use interpretation skills to help weigh those, and that impacts how we go forward with the information. Many of you know about the ALS-FRS, but this comes up in trials a lot, and so this is that 48-point scale that many people will fill out in clinics, with higher scores being better. And just to highlight here that 1-point drop can be sometimes less significant and sometimes more significant. So for climbing stairs, a 1-point drop is from normal to slowly climbing stairs. But for walking, you can go from walking with assistance for a 2 down to non-ambulatory or not walking, and that's still a 1-point drop. And so there is some subjective inequality despite the same score. From my perspective, I view treatments in ALS in 3 big categories: symptomatic treatments, and that could include excessive saliva pooling in your mouth and helping mitigate that, or disease-modifying treatments, and some of those we're going to talk about today, and then clinical trials and research opportunities. The current landscape for Health Canada approved treatments in ALS includes these 3 treatments, and I've listed them based on their historic discovery, and I've compared them based on a few features that I think are helpful for our conversation related to Edaravone. So the first treatment is riluzole, and this came out in 1995. And it's a pill that's taken twice a day. It works at the excitotoxic mechanism where too much glutamate causes nerve cell damage. And with the phase 3 trials, it was shown to extend life by on average of 3 months for patients living with ALS compared to the placebo group. This, because of the time that this has been out now for many decades, we have several real-world studies that show mixed results. And I wanted to highlight this because the real-world evidence doesn't have the same quality that we have in the phase 3 studies. But 8 of these real-world studies showed benefit, on the range from 6 to 19 months survival. 3 studies showed smaller benefit, and 4 studies showed no benefit at all. So this is a perspective that we're going to use to carry forward in our discussion. Edaravone came out in 2018. We're going to talk more about the history, the development, and the mechanism of action for this one specifically, but it is helpful to compare within the group as a whole. It's an IV formulation in 2018, and now an oral suspension approved in 2022. A free radical scavenger for antioxidant effects in helping patients living with ALS. And the primary phase 3 outcome was slowing the disease progression by 33%, and we'll talk about this more. There's been one real-world study that hasn't shown benefit. And so it's hard to know with one study what this means, especially in the context of the riluzole, where we know that there are both beneficial and non-beneficial real-world studies in that drug with much more extensive study. Finally, AMX0035, and all these drugs have 2 names. I'm just going to stick with the generic names for today. That's also known as Albrioza, if you saw on the prior slide. Approved by Health Canada in 2022. It's a powder dissolved in water. Works at 2 mechanisms as a combined drug at the mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum, 2 organelles within the cell. Now, the thing to highlight here, though, in contrast to what I told you is the usual process, is they haven't done the phase 3 trial yet. We don't have the results, and they're currently investigating this in Europe and the United States. And so I can't give you a comparative efficacy or effect from this treatment yet because we're still waiting to find that out. And it's too early to know about real-world data yet, but that is also coming. So switching now to talking more about Edaravone and the history of Edaravone. This was first developed as a treatment for acute stroke to help reduce the inflammation and damaging effects in the brain. And it's been approved for stroke in Japan since 2001, not approved in other countries throughout the world. In Canada, it's not available for stroke, partly because it showed some early benefits that didn't continue on in terms of longer data point outcomes. But the story of Edaravone for ALS came about then in the early 2000s, and they started to develop this based on its antioxidant properties and corresponding potential benefit for ALS patients. And they designed 2 phase 3 trials at this stage. The one was quite large with over 200 patients, and the other was quite a lot smaller with 25 patients, but the patients were more severely affected. Both of these trials, unfortunately, did not show any benefit of Edaravone. It was only when they went back to the larger study of 200 patients that they saw that there was some potential benefit in a certain subgroup of individuals with milder disease at onset, moderate rates of progression, limited or no respiratory involvement. And in those patients, they did see a potential benefit. And so they designed this next phase 3 trial with those individuals specifically in mind, trying to focus whether or not this treatment could work. And so the criteria of these patients were adults between 20 and 75 with a disease duration under 2 years from symptom onset, minimal disability from the disease, and minimal respiratory involvement. Half of the group got the treatment intervention arm, and the other half of the group roughly had a placebo infusion. And then if we look at the benefits, they showed a slowing or a reduction in the rate of progression on the ALS-FRS in the rate of decline by approximately 33%. And this was an added benefit because to other disease-modifying therapies, because many of the patients were on riluzole, the pill. And so this seemed to be an added benefit on top of that showed that change. I'll show it in one other way in terms of how the study showed this. At the end of 6 months, those who received Edaravone as a whole dropped their ALS score by 5 points. Remember, higher is better, so a smaller drop is better. And those who received placebo dropped by 7.5 points. And for a total absolute difference then of 2.5 points on that ALS-FRS. for which we've already kind of talked about what a 1-point value means. So this study showed that the results were statistically significant, and as physicians, we always then look to the next level to say, is this clinically meaningful? And ALS experts have felt that a 20 to 25% rate in the change of slope on the ALS-FRS is clinically meaningful, and patient groups living with ALS have felt that between a 2 or 3 point difference in the ALS-FRS is clinically meaningful. So this trial did show that it met, maybe just barely, but met those clinically meaningful beneficial outcomes as well. There were several other endpoints that were looked at, and from a strength perspective, they looked at the lung vital capacity, your grip strength, and pincer strength, and unfortunately none of these as secondary endpoints showed any clinical benefit. I wanted to look at this from a couple other perspectives because I think it adds nuance and information. From a regulatory body perspective, the drug has been approved by 6 different countries throughout the world, but has been declined by the European medical approval body. And they cited that they didn't feel that the confidence of the data shown in the initial trials that were done would translate to their patient population. For real-world data, I mentioned there was one trial so far. This trial tried to match patients prospectively, moving it forward, who were on Edaravone with similar patients who were not on Edaravone. And at the end of the day, they found and were able to match about 130 in each group. And unfortunately, some dropped out as expected, with 116 remainder for the analysis. And their study didn't show any significant benefit at the end of the day. I highlight this not to say this changes that benefit I just outlined, but to show a bit of nuance and context, and again to reference that we are dealing with levels of different quality of information, and that phase 3 study showing benefit remains the higher quality evidence to help guide our interpretation. So we hope for more results, and there are some on the way, some of which we're doing locally in Canada with the CNDR, looking at real-world evidence with patients on this medication compared to those not. Some observational studies looking at disease biomarkers, and those are listed there, and we anticipate those results to help further guide this treatment. And so I wanted to still kind of give a bit of a expert recommendation, and I'll make this more individual from my end, because I still, despite showing you nuance to the information and data, at the end of the day, Edaravone does show, based on the highest quality evidence we have, that it slows the rate of ALS disease progression based on the ALS-FRS by 33%, and that's in addition to other benefits received from riluzole. And so we do recommend it in our patient population and in our clinics. There's obviously personalization that happens and incorporation and infusions of your own values, recognizing that this treatment does not cure ALS, unfortunately, and slowing ALS progression rates down does still mean, unfortunately, that ALS will continue to progress, but at a slower rate. I'm going to transition now to that oral suspension, which is the new components that we have. And this graph essentially shows you both the IV and the oral distribution in the body as it's absorbed. And if you don't see the two different lines, it's because they completely overlap, showing essentially the same pharmacodynamics and kinetics that you'd want to see that it's essentially the same medication with a different route. And so that was shown in healthy controls, and they did a subsequent safety study looking at side effects in a large group of patients living with ALS, and showed that this treatment is well tolerated with very few side effects and no serious side effects, as an important point to take home. Some of the side effects that were seen were fatigue, dizziness, headache, and nausea, all under 5%, as you can see there. In terms of the administration and some of the details, it comes in a bottle that's then drawn up into a syringe so that you can accurately measure the appropriate 5 milliliter dose, which is an incredibly small volume. So just quickly, that's about a teaspoon, although it should be accurately measured with a syringe. The bottle can be stored at room temperature, but does have a certain shelf life. The administration is on an empty stomach, and so this depends on the type of food eaten beforehand, typically 8 hours after a high-fat meal, 4 hours after a low-fat meal, or 2 hours after just a caloric supplement such as a protein drink, and avoiding food for the next hour after the medication has been administered. And that's summarized in a similar format just in this table here. The dosing is the same as it is for the IV infusion, where it's 14 days for the first month, and then every month thereafter it's 10 out of the first 14 days, followed by a 14-day drug-free period ongoing. Some of the precautions outlined for the medication, overall, like I said, very safe. There is a sulfite component in it, so for sulfa allergies, there's a risk of reaction, hypersensitivity, and cautions in severe renal insufficiency due to the clearance, and no significant drug-to-drug interactions. From a coverage perspective, if you're interested in terms of are you able to get access to this, I want to go through some of the specifics to try to answer common questions at a whole. Right now, and this is a dynamic, constantly changing landscape, there's no provincial coverage yet for Blue Cross or Alberta Blue Cross, but these negotiations are ongoing and anticipated to come to fruition in the timeline of months. 70% of private drug plans would currently cover it now. Blue Cross has specific criteria. Many of the private drug coverage companies follow the same criteria for who can get access to this, and this models the initial phase 3 trial that I outlined for that patient population that showed benefit. And so this includes disease duration with symptoms less than 2 years, vital capacity, that lung capacity or breathing test, more than 80%, and minimal disability from your disease as measured on the ALS-FRS. That's to start the medication, and there's some important distinguishing things there. That's just to start it. The renewal process, to continue it as the cycle comes up for renewal, you need to remain ambulatory, be able to cut your food and feed yourselves, and have no permanent non-invasive ventilation. So if you think you meet those criteria and do have an interest in this treatment option, it's best to discuss it with your neurologist at the next ALS clinic appointment, or contact Denise, and then proceed, if you meet the criteria, to apply for the medication based on your current disease state. If you apply now, all those measurements that they want to see would be taken at this point in time. And should your disease progress further, you would still potentially meet them based, or have the approval already set up in place based on the date that you apply. You can then choose to either start IV medication. So if you picture you're on Blue Cross, but they don't have coverage yet for Blue Cross, you could, for the oral suspension, you could start the IV form while you wait for the Blue Cross negotiations to complete, and then start oral suspension when available. Or you can still apply and hold off with starting the IV infusions and just wait until the oral suspension is available. Hopefully that kind of helps answer some of the major questions. I think we'll leave questions for at the end so we can just go from one talk to the next. But thanks for your attention. We're excited to be able to talk about this new therapy in ALS.